Okay. Just setting everything up here. All right. So we're on chapter 18 of ERAGON, and I'm just going to get started. Chapter 18. Thunder, Roar, and Lightning Crackle. The next morning, ERAGON avoided bringing to mind any of the recent events. They were too painful for him to consider. Instead, he focused his energies on figuring out how to find and kill the Razek. I'll do it with my bow, he decided, imagining how the cloaked figures would look with arrows sticking out of them. He had difficulty even standing up. His muscles cramped with the slightest movement, and one of his fingers was hot and swollen. When they were ready to leave, he mounted Kadok and said acidly, "If this keeps up, you're going to batter me to pieces." "I wouldn't push you so hard if I didn't think you were strong enough." "For once, I wouldn't mind being thought less of," muttered ERAGON. Kadok pranced nervously as Saphira approached. Saphira eyed the horse with something close to disgust and said, "There's nowhere to hide on the plains, so I'm not going to bother trying to stay out of sight. I'll just fly above you from now on." She took off, and they began the steep descent. In many places, the trail all but disappeared, leaving them to find their own way down. At times, they had to dismount and lead the horses on foot, holding on the trees to keep from falling down the slope. The ground was scattered with loose rocks, which made the footing treacherous. The ordeal left them hot and irritable, despite the cold. They stopped to rest when they reached the bottom near midway. The Enora River veered to their left and flowed northward. A biting wind scoured the land, whipped them unmercifully. The soil was parched, the dirt flew into their eyes. It unnerved ERAGON how flat everything was. The plains were unbroken by hummocks or mounds. He had lived here his entire life, surrounded by mountains and hills. Without them he felt exposed and vulnerable, like a mouse under the eagle's keen eye. The trail split in three once it reached the plains. The first branch turned north, towards Cunion, one of the greatest northern cities. The second one led straight across the plains, and the last went south. They examined all three for traces of the Razek, and eventually found their tracks, headed directly into the grasslands. "It seems they've gone to Yozak," said Brahm, with a perplexed air. "Where's that?" "Due east and 4 days away, if all goes well. It's a small village, situated by the Ninor River." He gestured at the Enora, which streamed away from them to the north. "Our only supply of water is here. We'll have to replenish our water skins before attempting to cross the plains. There isn't another pool or stream between here and the Yukuzik." The excitement of the hunt began to rise within ERAGON. In a few days, maybe less than a week, he would use his arrows to avenge Garrow's death. And then he refused to think about what might happen afterward. They filled the water skins, watered the horses, and drank as much as they could from the river. Saphira joined them and took several gulps of water. Fortified, they turned eastward and started to cross the plains. ERAGON decided that it would be the wind that drove him crazy first. Everything had made him miserable. His chapped lips, parched tongue, and burning eyes stemmed from it. The ceaseless gusting followed them throughout the day. Evening only strengthened the wind instead of subduing it. Since there was no shelter, they were forced to camp in the open. ERAGON found some scrub brush, a short, tough plant that thrived on harsh conditions, and pulled it up. He made a careful pile and tried to light it, but the woody stems only smoked and gave off a pungent smell. Frustrated, he tossed the tinderbox to Brahm. "I can't make it burn. especially with this blasted wind. See if you can get it going, otherwise dinner will be cold. Brahm knelt by the bush and looked at it critically. He rearranged a couple of branches, then struck the tinderbox, sending a cascade of sparks onto the plants. There was smoke, but nothing else. Brahm scowled and tried again. But his luck was no better than ERAGON's. "Brisinger!" he swore angrily, striking the flint again. Flames suddenly appeared, and he stepped back with a pleased expression. "There we go. It must have been smoldering inside." They sparred with mock swords while the food cooked. Fatigue made it hard for the both of them, so they kept the session short. After they had eaten, they lay next to Saphira and slept, grateful for her shelter. The same cold wind greeted them in the morning, sweeping over the dreadful flatness. ERAGON's lips had cracked during the night. Every time he smiled or talked, beads of blood covered them. Licking them only made it worse. It was the same for Brahm. They let the horses drink sparingly from their supply of water before mounting them. The day was a monotonous trek of endless plodding. On the third day, ERAGON woke well rested. That, coupled with the fact that the wind had stopped, put him in a cheery humor. His high spirits were dampened, however, when he saw the sky again ahead of them was dark with thunderheads. Brahm looked at the clouds and grimaced. "Normally, I wouldn't go into a storm like that. But we're in for a battering no matter what we do, so we might as well get some distance covered." It was still calm when they reached the storm front. As they entered its shadow, ERAGON looked up. The thundercloud had an exotic structure, forming a natural cathedral with a massive arched roof. With some imagination, he could see pillars, windows, soaring tiers, and snarling gargoyles. It was a wild beauty. As ERAGON lowered his gaze, a giant ripple raced towards them through the grass, flattening it. It took him a second to realize that there was a wave, a tremendous blast of wind. Brahm saw it too. They hunched their shoulders, preparing for the storm. The gale was almost upon them when ERAGON had a horrible thought and twisted in his saddle, yelling, both with his voice and mind, "Saphira, land!" Brahm's face grew pale. Overhead, they saw her dive towards the ground. "She's not going to make it." Saphira angled back, the way that they had come, to gain time. As he watched, the tempest's wrath struck them like a hammering blow. ERAGON gasped for breath and clutched the saddle as the frenzied howl filled his ears. Caddock swayed and dug his hooves into the ground, mane snapping in the air. The wind tore at their clothes with invisible fingers, while the air darkened with billowing clouds of dust. Yeah, of course. A little, cinema. ERAGON squinted, searching for Saphira. He saw her land heavily, and then crouched, clenching the ground with her talons. The wind reached her just as she started to fold her wings. With an angry yank, it unfurled them and dragged her into the air. For a moment she hung there, suspended by the storm's force. Then it slammed her down on her back. With a savage wench, ERAGON yanked Caddock around and galloped back up the trail, goading the horse with both heels and his mind. "Saphira!" he shouted, trying to stay on the ground. "I'm coming!" He felt a grim acknowledgement from her. As they neared Saphira, Caddock balked, so ERAGON leapt down and ran towards her. His bow banged against his head. A strong gust pushed him off balance, and he flew forward, landing on his chest. He skidded, then got back up with a snarl, ignoring the deep scrapes in his skin. Saphira was only 300 yards away. 3 yards away. But he could get no closer because of her flailing wings. She struggled to fold them against the overpowering gale. He rushed at her right wing, intending to hold it down, but the wind caught her, and she somersaulted over him. The spines on her back missed his head by inches. Saphira clawed at the ground, trying to stay down. Her wings began to lift again, but before they could flip her, ERAGON threw himself at the left one. The wing crumpled in the joints, and Saphira tucked it firmly against her body. ERAGON vaulted over her back and tumbled onto her other wing. Without warning, it was blown upward, sending him sliding to the ground. He broke his fall with a roll, then jumped up and grabbed the wing again. Saphira started to fold it, and he pushed with all of his strength. The wind battled him for a second, but with one last surge, they overcame it. ERAGON leaned against Saphira, panting. "Are you all right?" He could feel her trembling. She took a moment to answer. I think so." She sounded shaken. "Nothing's broken. I couldn't do anything. The wind wouldn't let me go. I was helpless." With a shudder, she fell silent. He looked at her, concerned. "Don't worry. You're safe now." He spotted Cadoc a ways off, standing with his back to the wind. With his mind, ERAGON instructed the horse to return to Brahm. He then got onto Saphira. She crept up the road, fighting the gale, while he clung to her back to keep his head down. When they reached Brahm, he shouted over the storm, "Is she hurt?" ERAGON shook his head and dismounted. Cadoc trotted over him, nickering. As he strode the horse's long cheek, Brahm pointed at a dark curtain of rain sweeping toward them in rippling gray sheets. "What else?" cried ERAGON, pulling his clothes tighter. He winced as the torrent reached them. The stinging rain was cold as ice. Before long they were drenched and shivering. Lightning lanced through the sky, flickering in and out of existence. Mile-high blue bolts streaked across the horizon, followed by peals of thunder that shook the ground below. It was beautiful, but dangerously so. Here and there, grass fires were ignited by streaks only to be extinguished by the rain. The wild elements were slow to abate, but as the day passed, they wandered elsewhere. Once again the sky was revealed, and the setting sun glowed with brilliance. As beams of light tinted the clouds with blazing colors, everything gained a sharp contrast. Brightly lit on one side, deeply shadowed on another. Objects had a unique sense of mass. Grass stalks seemed sturdy as marble pillars. Ordinary things took on an unearthly beauty. ERAGON felt as if he were sitting inside a painting. The rejuvenated earth smelled fresh, clearing their minds and raising their spirits. Saphira stretched, craning her neck, and roared happily. The horses skittered away from her, but ERAGON and Brahm smiled at her exuberance. Before the light faded, they stopped for the night in a shallow depression. Too exhausted to spar, they went straight to sleep. And that is the end of chapter 18. Let's see how long chapter 19 is, and I'll give it a read if it's shorter. Yeah, no problem. I think I linked my YouTube channel and my Twitch, so I have a bunch of other videos there. It's called Sleepy Swoozy, and you can watch those if you want to get caught up on what I'm reading. So yeah, this one's short, and I'm going to read this one as well. All right, chapter 19. Revelation at, what is this? Yazuak. Although they managed to partially refill the water skins during the storm, they drank the last of their water that morning. "I hope we're going right in the right direction," said ERAGON, crunching up the empty water bag, "because we'll be in trouble if we don't reach Yazuak today." Brahm did not seem disturbed. "I've traveled this way before. Yazuak will be in sight before dusk." ERAGON laughed doubtfully. "Perhaps you see something I don't." "How can you know when everything looks exactly the same from leagues around?" "Because I am not guided by the land, but by the stars and the sun. They will not lead us astray. Come, let us be off. It's foolish to conjure up woe when none exists. Yazuak will be there." His words proved true. Saphira spotted the village first, but it was not until later that day that the rest of them saw it as a dark bump on the horizon. Yazuak was still very far away. It was only visible because of the plain's uniform flatness. As they rode closer, a dark winding line appeared on either side of the town and disappeared into the distance. "The Ninor River," said Brahm, pointing at it. ERAGON pulled Cadoc to a stop. "Saphira will be seen if she stays with us for much longer. Should she hide with us while we go into the Yazuak?" Brahm scratched his chin and looked down at the town. "See that bend in the river? Have her wait there. It's far enough from Yazuak, so no one should find her, but close enough that she won't be left behind. We'll go through the town, get what we need, and then we'll meet her." "I don't like it," said Saphira, when Eragon explained the plan. "This is irritating, having to hide all the time like a criminal. You know what would happen if we were revealed." She grumbled, but gave in and flew away low to the ground. They kept a swift pace in anticipation of the food and drink they would soon enjoy. As they approached the small houses, they could see smoke from a dozen chimneys, but there was no one in the streets. An abnormal silence enveloped the village. By unspoken consent, they stopped before the first house. Eragon abruptly said, "There aren't any dogs barking." "No. Doesn't mean anything, though." "No." Eragon paused. "Someone should have seen us by now." "Yes." "Then why hasn't anyone come out?" Brom squinted at the sun. "Could be afraid?" "Could be," said Eragon. He was quiet for a moment. "And if it's a trap?" "The Razak might be waiting for us." "We need provisions and water. Where's the Ninor?" "Still need provisions." "True." Eragon looked around. "So we go in?" Brom flicked his reins. "Yes, but not like fools. This is the main entrance to Yazwak. If there's an ambush, it'll be along here. No one will expect us to arrive from a different direction." "Around to the side, then?" asked Eragon. Brom nodded and pulled out his sword, resting the bare blade across his saddle. Eragon strung his bow and nocked an arrow. They trotted quietly around the town and entered it cautiously. The streets were empty, except for a small fox that darted away as they came near. The houses were dark and foreboding, with shattered windows. Many of the doors swung on broken hinges. The horses rolled their eyes nervously. Eragon's palm tingled, but he resisted the urge to scratch it. As they rode into the center of town, he gripped his bow tighter, blanching. "God's above," he whispered. A mountain of bodies rose above them. The corpses stiff and grimaced. Their clothes were soaked in blood, and the churned ground was stained with it. Slaughtered men lay over women they tried to protect. Mothers still clasped their children, and lovers who had tried to shield each other rested in death's cold embrace. Black arrows stuck out of them all. Neither young nor old had been spared. But worst of all was the barbed spear. Tears blurred Eragon's vision as he tried to look away. But the dead faces held his attention. He stared at their open eyes and wondered how life could have left them so easily. What does our existence mean when it can end like this? A wave of hopelessness overwhelmed him. A crow dipped out of the sky, like a black shallow. Perched on the spear, it cocked its head and greedily scrutinized the corpse. "Oh, no, you don't," snarled Eragon, and he pulled back a bowstring and released it with a twang. With a puff of feathers, the crow fell over backward, the arrow protruding from its chest. Eragon fit another arrow to the string, but nausea rose from his stomach, and he threw up over Kadok's side. Brom patted him on the back. When Eragon was done, Brom asked gently, "Do you want to wait for me outside, Yakuzak?" "No, I'll stay," said Eragon shakily, wiping his mouth. He avoided looking at the gruesome sight before them. Who could have done? He could not force the words out. Brom bowed his head. "Those who love the pain and suffering of others. They wear many faces and go by many disguises. But here there is only one name for them. Evil. There is no understanding it. All we can do is pity and honor the victims." He dismounted Snowfire and walked around, inspecting the trampled ground carefully. "The Razak passed this way," he said, slowly. "But this wasn't their doing. This is Urgel work. The spear is of their make. A company of them came through here, perhaps as many as 100. It's odd. I know of only a few instances when they have gathered in such..." He knelt and examined a footprint intently. With a curse, he ran back to Snowfire and leapt onto him. "Ride!" he hissed tightly, spurring Snowfire forward. "There are still Urgels here. Eragon jammed his heels into Caddock. The horse jumped forward and raced after Snowfire. They dashed past the houses and were almost to the edge of Yakuzak when Eragon's palm tingled again. He saw a flicker of movement to his right when a giant fist smashed him out of the saddle. He flew back over Caddock and crashed into a wall, holding onto his bow only by instinct. Gasping and stunned, he staggered upright. Hugging his side, an Urgle stood over him, his face set with a gross leer. The monster was tall, thick, and broader than a doorway, with gray skin and yellow piggish eyes. Muscles bulged on his arms and chest, which was covered too by a small breastplate. An iron cap rested over the pair of ram's horns curling from his temples, and a round shield was bound to one arm. His powerful hand held a short, wicked sword. Behind him, Eragon saw Braum rein in Snowfire and start back, only to be stopped by the appearance of a second Urgle, this one with an axe. "Run, you fool!" Braum cried to Eragon, cleaving at his enemy. The Urgle in front of Eragon roared and swung his sword mightily. Eragon jerked back with a startled yelp as the weapon whistled past his cheek. He spun around and fled towards the center of Yazuak, heart pounding wildly. The Urgle pursued him, heavy boots thudding. Eragon sent a desperate cry to help for Saphira, then forced himself to go even faster. The Urgle rapidly gained ground despite Eragon's efforts. Large fangs separated in a soundless bellow. With the Urgle almost upon him, Eragon strung an arrow, spun to a stop, took aim, and released. The Urgle snapped up his arm and caught the quivering bolt on his shield. The monster collided with Eragon before he could shoot again, and they fell to the ground in a confused tangle. Eragon sprang to his feet and rushed back to Braum, who was trading fierce blows with his opponent from Snowfire's back. "Where are the rest of the Urgles?" wondered Eragon frantically. "Are these two the only ones in Yazuak?" There was a loud smack, and Snowfire reared, whinnying. Braum doubled over his saddle, blood streaming down his arm. The Urgle beside him howled in triumph and raised his axe for the death blow. A deafening scream tore from Eragon as he charged at the Urgle head first. The Urgle paused in astonishment, then faced him contemptuously, swinging his axe. Eragon ducked under the two-handed blow and clawed the Urgle's side, leaving bloody furrows. The Urgle's face twisted with rage. He slashed again, but missed Eragon, who dived to the side and scrambled down an alley. Eragon concentrated on leading the Urgles away from Braum. He slipped into a narrow passageway between two horses, saw it was a dead end, and slid to a stop. He tried to back out, but the Urgles had already blocked the entrance. They advanced, cursing him in their gravelly voices. Eragon swung his head from side to side, searching for a way out, but there was none. As he faced the Urgles, images flashed in his mind. The dead villagers piled around the spear, the children who would never grow to adulthood. At the thought of their fate, a burning, fiery power gathered from every part of his body. It was more than a desire for justice. It was his entire being rebelling against the fact of death, that he would cease to exist. The power grew stronger and stronger until he felt ready to burst from the contained force. He stood tall and straight, all fear gone. He raised his bow smoothly. The Urgles laughed and lifted their shields. Eragon sighted down the shaft, as he had done 100 times, and aligned the arrowhead with his target. The energy inside him burned at an unbearable level. He had to release it, or it would consume him. A word suddenly leapt, unbidden, to his lips. He shot, yelling, "Brisinger." The arrow hissed through the air, glowing with a crackling blue light. It struck the lead Urgle on the forehead, and the air surrounding with an explosion. A blue shockwave blasted the monster's head, killing the other Urgle instantly. It reached Eragon before he had time to react. It passed through him without harm, dissipating against the houses. Eragon stood panting, then looked at his icy palm. The Gedway Ignazia was glowing like white-hot metal, yet even as he watched, it faded back to normal. He clenched his fist, then a weave of exhaustion washed over him. He felt strange and feeble, as if he had not eaten for days. His knees buckled, and he sagged against a wall. And that is the end of chapter 19. The next chapter is admonishments. And I will read that at another time.